All right. Welcome everyone to a special recording of the Citizens Guide. We're recording this the night of Thursday, January the 7th. So the day after the attempted insurrection in DC. And Connor and I are so excited to be joined by Matthew Kinney, a fellow junior at Rhodes College. He is a double major with political science and Greek and Roman studies, as well as being the governor of the Tennessee Intercollegiate State Legislature, which is a mock state legislature program that Connor and I participate in as well. So welcome, Matthew, to the show. You're here because you are truly an expert in kind of the interior workings of Congress and our government at large. So I guess just take it away. Kind of, you can introduce yourself more if you want, or just kind of give an opener to what's been going on in DC.
Well, I just wanted to say, first off, thank y'all for having me. I think this is a really excellent program that y'all have. I think there's a lot that happened within the past couple days, so I think it's worth just diving into right away. On Wednesday, January 6th, when Congress met to certify the electoral votes from the 2020 presidential election, there was largely among congressional members not much of a concern regarding security. They thought that the Capitol Police were going to be able to handle it, and it was just going to be a protest. But as we clearly kind of saw, that turned out drastically differently. I think I'll start with just kind of a decap of what happened on the day, kind of going in rough chronological order. So the first break through the barriers was right about 1 p.m. Eastern time, when Capitol Police were pushed back from bike racks that they had set up around the perimeter of the Capitol. And from that, it took about an hour and a half to get from the perimeter that Capitol Police had set up to inside the halls of Congress. But I think that in that time frame, one of the things that the Capitol Police were responding to was the discovery of pipe bombs in the vicinity of the Republican National Convention and the DNC. The DNC and RNC were evacuated, and a suspicious vehicle was on Capitol grounds. There was also a potential suspicious package in the Madison complex and the Cannon office building. The Cannon office building and the Madison complex were both evacuated by Capitol Police at right about 2 o'clock, which is roughly about the time when protesters began approaching Capitol grounds, and why it was so difficult to hold the Capitol complex itself.
And not to interrupt you, Matthew, but for our listeners, those are buildings where Congress people have offices, correct?
Yes, so there are underground tunnels that connect the office buildings and especially to the Cannon and Russell office buildings. And the Madison complex is part of the Library of Congress. It's actually a really small building, but Capitol Police were they had to evacuate those buildings for fear of an explosion. So there's a substantial amount of resources that were initially devoted to evacuating those buildings, which may explain why some of the Capitol Police presence on the exterior of Congress was so limited in the early onset. About an hour and a half later, from 1 p.m. Eastern time, Capitol Police were pushed inside the building by demonstrators, and the Capitol building itself was breached during the discussion of the objection of Arizona's electoral votes. We can talk about the electoral votes later, but the House and Senate chambers were locked at about 2:30 Eastern time, and Vice President Pence was among the first to be evacuated. Secret Service, as soon as anything that they thought went wrong, I think it was about 2:15, Secret Service made the first call to say that we need to start thinking about evacuating Vice President Pence. The Senate chamber was generally evacuated first, and it's my understanding that there was not a serious attempt to hold the chamber by Capitol Police officers. Their efforts were concentrated on the House. Capitol Police, there was an aide by the Capitol Police that took the dais on the position of the presiding officer where Vice President stood and announced that there was a breach of the Capitol. Senators and some representatives were initially taken to the Capitol Visitor Center, which is a kind of bunker complex built in the aftermath of 9/11 to improve the control of visitor security. But the protesters had already made it into there, and they were redirected to what we still consider an undisclosed location. We don't know where they were met. The house was secured by the Sergeant at Arms and Capitol Police, and to my knowledge, was not breached. So, if you guys have any questions.
Well, at some point, there were not protesters. There were people in the house, though, because there's images of people in the speaker's chair. So I think at some point, after the legislators had left, unless I'm mistaking that for a picture of the Senate, I could have that wrong.
I do believe it's the Senate. So the House so a lot of people entering into the Senate, it has a much smaller number of desks, obviously, and that's where most of the protesters were able to get in. And the person who was sitting at the desk was at the chair of the vice president. And the picture of the person climbing down from the gallery is also in the Senate as well, because the Senate gallery is actually much lower than the House, because the House has to fit in so many seats that the seats go underneath the gallery, which means that there's a much larger space between. So it just generally the House gallery is taller, and if you jump down from that, you'd probably break your leg or something.
Right.
So yeah, in the Capitol crypt, which is the area underneath the Capitol rotunda, there was serious fighting amongst Capitol police officers, and tear gas was deployed. Press and House members were initially barred inside the House gallery, which was part of their social distancing efforts, as they put some House members in the gallery. And they were eventually escorted by Capitol Police out of the House chamber after about an hour. There are a lot of things that happened while they were inside the Capitol, but generally a lot of the efforts were focused on getting security inside the complex. So the Senate was generally cleared first, just because it was generally deemed as less compromised, and the House was still under siege, so to speak, by the people at the front doors. You saw the picture. It's the item that they moved in front of the door, I believe, was a form of umbrella stand where they can put bags for their umbrellas, and to pick up papers and items. It's always been to the backside of the House chamber. It's not like a bookshelf or anything. And what's interesting to me is that there are generally less protesters in the Senate than there were headed towards the direction of the House. And I think that has in part to do with the House being under Democratic control and the Senate being under Republican control. I do think that there were people in the Senate galleries. It's my understanding that had hand ties. And I'll get into that as to a little bit of analysis later. But when protesters made it into the Capitol, there were a lot of questions that arose as to how and whether the National Guard could be mobilized independent of the president, because the DC does not have a state. National Guard cannot be independently mobilized. Mayor does not have that authority. Only the authority resides with the president. So the acting Secretary of Defense did acknowledge that it was Pence and Pelosi that were initially the ones that asked him to mobilize, but earlier today at a press conference, the Secretary of Defense took responsibility and said it was himself and the Army Secretary that mobilized 1,100 National Guard.
What do we think the ramifications are of seemingly the commander-in-chief being excluded from these talks of deploying the National Guard? And if I'm correct, there was talks to begin with that the acting secretary, not acting, maybe, well, the Secretary of Defense, the acting Secretary of Defense declined the authorization and deployment of the National Guard early on in the crisis.
So there are reports by White House aides that Donald Trump initially refused and rebuffed any efforts to send in the National Guard, and I think that's mostly a byproduct of his obstruction and incitement of this insurrection. I think that for Donald Trump, what it means is that his presidency has effectively ended, not just from the electoral certification, but from the complete rejection of his responsibility to do this. From a constitutional perspective, this is infuriating. I think that Lindsey Graham's comments earlier today during a press conference that Congress, it is possible that if these people had serious malcontent, they could have blown up the Congress. They could have gone in there with weapons and shot members of Congress, disrupted the line of succession, and in my personal opinion, Trump's obstruction and contempt of protecting Congress in this matter is as serious, if not more serious, than his actions in his initial impeachment trial earlier in January 2020. Trump went to Camp David earlier today. I think that's where he will remain for the rest of his presidency, hiding in cowardice. I think that Republicans at this point are ready to consider how to move the party forward past Trump.
Yeah, I think 2 points on stuff you just said on the intentions of the rioters, the mob that broke into the Capitol building. There was a picture of a man with an armful of zip ties, and I know the reporting is still coming out constantly on this. Do you think there was a planned attempt to kidnap, hold hostage members of Congress?
I think that one of the consensus circling around the people who kind of reviewed the people there is that there were two types of people. There were people who didn't really know what to do once they got there because they've never really been to the Capitol before. They didn't understand what was happening in Congress that day. And there were people who, on the opposite side, knew exactly what they wanted to do. I think there were people who wanted to break into the chambers, potentially take legislators hostage, steal election certificates, and occupy Congress. You can see evidence of that through people rummaging through the senators' desks. The ransacking of the parliamentarian's office, I think, was an effort to try to find the electoral certificates because those were taken away by Senate parliamentary aides. So I think, furthermore, that the people who had a plan to occupy Congress actually pose real security and cybersecurity threats because their time in Congress, we don't know what they did to while they were in Congress. If they wanted to, although I highly doubt this happened, all computers in Congress are susceptible to USB attacks. So any data given to a congressional member through classified information clauses and through their privileges as members of Congress, that's all technically up and available to members of the public at this point.
Right. Anybody with a flash drive could have walked into the speaker's office and plugged it right in.
And I think that the confusion and overall lack of success by these people demonstrates a lack of conviction, that they didn't seriously understand what they were doing there today. So this is just a hypothetical. There's a staff to the left of the rostrum in the House, and if the House had actually been breached, then taking that staff, it's my understanding under parliamentary rules, would prevent the House from convening until the staff was recovered, because it represents the binding of the House of Representatives. And so it's a weird symbolical little gesture, but I don't think it would have actually been taken because these people didn't know what they were doing.
Right. And is that the same staff that the speaker has the pin that she wears? Is that
Correct.
One and the same? So just a massive symbol of our democracy. I think Speaker Pelosi this morning called the Capitol the temple to democracy, and it was defiled on Wednesday. And I think that's a powerful way of describing yesterday's events and the significance of symbols, but also of the real personal danger that a lot of people found themselves in yesterday.
Speaking of symbols, like, this is something that, like, it's deeply troubling. And I think a lot of people are trying to compare it to the Black Lives Matter movements, but I think it's a fundamentally separate issue that deserves comparisons in certain aspects, but is not in others. For context, I think that it's my understanding, I talked with a constitutional law professor a little bit about this on Twitter, but it's the most direct engagement of a chief executive in violence against the legislative body in Western history since Charles I stormed the Houses of Parliament in 1642 with 400 armed guards, and which proved to be one of the most significant catalysts for the English Civil War. I don't think that there has been any other so significant a degree of executive involvement in this type of activity since then. So I think that the symbolism of this alone is infuriating, and I think the real world implications of this are quite destructive.
So, and then in your opinion, there's been talk today about how Congress should respond, whether they should have adjourned until the Senate a couple days before inauguration, the House after inauguration, when there's two constitutional remedies to this situation, the 25th Amendment and the impeachment procedures. What do you think is the proper course for having some sort of red line for the president and executive power in this situation?
So there's a number of paths that Congress can take. But the problem is how do they institute them between now and Trump leaving office? We're 100% positive that Donald Trump, he released a statement earlier today that he has effectively affirmed the transition process and will give up power on January 20th. That was released through an aide via Twitter. And going forward, I think the question is in the immediate vicinity, Congress can approve emergency funding actions and then strip personnel power and funding for any officials that may deem to support Trump. They can take away his salary. They can remove his chief of staff position and those that might support him to the point to where he has no effective capability of violating the law and further endangering the nation. But in a more serious constitutional attempt, I think that impeachment is warranted in these circumstances, but I don't think it's likely to happen. I think the 25th Amendment process by which the vice president assumes the powers of the presidency is from a long-term perspective only a stopgap measure, because the way the 25th Amendment is set up is that the cabinet and the vice president may recognize that an inability may exist in the president, but if the president counteracts that and says, no, I am able to execute the duties of my office, then there's about a 3-day waiting period before the president automatically assumes the powers of the presidency. So at most, it would go for 3 days, because there's no way that Trump wouldn't attempt to fight that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I believe in the case of the 25th Amendment, after the vice president and the cabinet went through that process, I think Congress and the president, goes back and says, no, I am fit for the job. I think it gets tossed into Congress, which again, if you're going to do that, you might as well just go through the impeachment proceedings. And I saw a report today that said vice president has signaled that he's not taking any steps to go the 25th Amendment path. So I think in that case, at least my view is, and I understand the time limitations, I think the Congress has no choice but to impeach him. I think the House has a very sacred duty to the Constitution, to the country, to the voters, to the citizens, to everyone living in this country, to the world, to do everything they can. And their power is so limited. Impeachment without removal is a slap on the wrist, if even that. I would like to see the House impeach.
Agreed. Not only that, I would point out that even if the House does impeach, it would be the first time a president was impeached twice under separate occasions for separate activities, such that it would not be easy for historians to consider Trump as anything less than possibly the worst president.
Right. And then if the House impeaches and the Senate convicts, that comes with a ban on holding any federal office in the future, barring Trump from running again in 2024. If he's delusional enough to think that's possible again. And I think
that would take a separate vote. So the Senate would vote to convict, and then the Senate is then offered the opportunity to move for a further vote to qualify for disbarring from office.
Interesting. I didn't realize it took 2 separate votes.
It would be a 2 separate vote measure. And I think that Congress in that sense I think they're interested in it, but I don't think it's the conviction or the disbarring will happen. I don't think it's likely in congressional minds, let alone because of the fact that the Senate at this point is adjourning for pro forma sessions, and you would need a unanimous consent agreement to pull them out of those pro forma sessions and consider articles of impeachment, which you would require a number of senators on the floor. Though I think it's still possible, it's hard to not see an objection of some kind.
Absolutely. And there are articles of impeachment kind of circulating from House members, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, so very liberal congresswomen. But it's interesting. I saw one congressperson, and his articles included the phone call with the Georgia Secretary of State as the first article, and then the second article was the incitement of the insurrection yesterday. So it's just interesting that all of this has happened in the same week, and the Georgia call alone, in my mind, merits impeachment, at least in a vacuum when we're not some few days away from an inauguration. But both taken together, really just shows how the depravity of his actions and his complete ignorance of very basic norms that have been in place for a really long time.
I think that his efforts in Georgia do constitute impeachment alone, and from a visual and symbolic perspective, yesterday's events on Wednesday and the call with the Georgia Secretary of State constitute nothing less than a serious damage to our standing abroad as well, and our ability to project peace and democracy around the globe for decades to come, regardless of anything that Joe Biden may be able to accomplish in his presidency. There's one other thing that I think is important to note here, and it's that the Capitol Police are a largely opaque organization. They're not transparent. We don't know a whole lot of how their procedures are put in place for these types of events. They are not well equipped for this, despite their budget. So they were not well equipped for this. So their budget is $516 million, with a $51 million increase from last year's fiscal year. And as of September 2020, they had roughly about 2,000 officers. But in comparison to DC Metro Police, they have about 83% of the Metro Police's budget, but only half the number of officers of the DC office. So there's a lot of questions that are going to be asked in the coming weeks and months as to the Capitol's security.
And those questions need answers. I saw today, and this I think is separate than Capitol Police, but Senator Schumer, incoming majority leader, more likely than not, is going to dismiss the Sergeant at Arms of the Senate. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I think that is routine, that the party
okay.
The party in control of the chamber appoints their own Sergeant at Arms before each session.
Okay.
Generally, that is correct. It is not a nonpartisan position like the clerk or the parliamentarians. But I will say that the dismissal of the House Sergeant at Arms, the Senate Sergeant at Arms, and the Chief of Capitol Police are the big three in terms of accountability. I think that you can't, those are the highest branches of Capitol security that you can get to before moving into constitutional officers. But I will say that rank and file officers, there's a police union statement released by Capitol Police today that said that they didn't feel prepared. They didn't feel like they had adequate leadership, and they didn't feel like they had the adequate resources to do their jobs. And they blame on not only the chief of police for the Capitol Police Force, but also for the assistant chiefs. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how far does the turnover go, and not only of personnel turnover, but for the reformation of the branch itself. I personally would like to see an overhaul of the communication system between like members and staffers in the Capitol Police Force, transparency and public information engagement. They're not subject to FOIA requests, which is one of the few public organizations that are not subject. And an overhaul of the funding and spending structure of how Capitol Police spends their money, and coordination with Secret Service intel gathering. I think that as constitutional officers of co-equal branches, Capitol Police should be given the same resources as the Secret Service is given to protect their branch and to protect their complex.
And FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act requests.
Correct. So we are not going to be, we are not going to be able to request through the FOIA system the documents and the decisions and the emails and the communications that have been circulated in the aftermath and in the midst of the Capitol Police failures and the sieging of the Capitol.
My final kind of thought and then question for you, Matthew, is what does it mean when you have a branch of government invaded at the urging of the executive branch, the legislative branch, invaded by and incited by the behest of the executive of the other branch of government? What is stopping another president in the same position as Donald Trump from doing that same thing again, absent of any congressional action, of a censure, impeachment without conviction? It seems now that there's a wing in the Republican Party, even after the attacks that voted to overturn the election results still, that are perfectly fine, not so much with the actions, but with this attempt at overthrowing our democracy. What does it look like? And like, how, a layered question, what is the system damaged irreparably if these safeguards don't come into function, don't work? Like, if not now, what's the point of the 25th Amendment or the impeachment / and then conviction and then ban on the president?
This is really quite the loaded gun here, and I'll go ahead
Yeah.
and just
we expect you to fix American democracy right
Please.
now, Matthew. You have
I'll go ahead and discharge that loaded gun. This is the first time in the United States that we have, in my opinion, not negotiated the transfer of power peacefully during a presidential transition. The only other thing that might come close would be the election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, and the election of 1800 between Jefferson and Adams. So there's real cause for consternation about the health of our democracy. This is not some protest. This is a fundamental event in American history that should rightfully go down as a fundamental marking point. I can only hope that Congress will take action to prevent the spread of the executive. But I will say this: this is a byproduct of the nationalization of American politics, to say that we follow one leader and American politics is consumed by what that one leader does and doesn't do, not only while they're in office, but while they're running for office. The fact that we identify our political behavior based off of who we voted for in a presidential election is deeply concerning to the separation of powers and to a federalist government designed by our Constitution. I think to prevent further abuse, it's going to take serious concerted collective action on behalf of Congress to reassert itself as the dominant branch. And I hope that Biden will support that effort through improved control over budgetary matters and improving oversight over the executive response. And I think that improving Capitol security, as I mentioned earlier, and making it on par with Secret Service will help to improve the branch's status as a co-equal branch. And the public eye, from a less constitutional perspective, that's a much more complex question. I think that part of the drain the swamp rhetoric is part of a longstanding American libertarian opposition to government, but I think that too recently that has been capitalized as a means of saying that not only is government not necessary, but it is a threat to your liberties and should be treated as a threat. To say that the government representatives no longer represent you is fundamentally untrue. If you don't think that your representatives represent you, then vote for somebody else or don't vote. If you don't vote, then unfortunately you're not being represented. And I can only say that that is your own fault. So this is part of a larger problem within the American society about resistance to government and our refusal to accept the reality that a modern government requires at least some form of authority. And that doesn't just rely on the executive, that relies on the legislature as well. That relies on government regulation, and that relies on tiered systems of accountability. If we put all of our accountability into the executive branch and focus on presidential elections, then we're not going to get anywhere, because that's only one person, and our government was not designed to be run by one person.
Yeah. That was excellent.
Excellent thesis. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us to do this on short notice and just a crazy time in our politics. And it's great to have your perspective and your knowledge and your wisdom of all of these issues. Yeah, and listeners, thank you for joining us for our special episode. And Connor and I will talk to you at the beginning of next week, like we always do, with more of these same issues. But yeah, thank you. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you very much for having me.